everyone, it's Margarita with another episode of People Jew Wanna Know podcast. Some of you may know that I study behavioral science for my master's degree at Penn, and today's guest really feels like a dream come true conversation for anybody familiar with the behavioral science and behavioral economics fields. Behavioral science is the study of human behavior which looks to understand why people act a certain way and how we can influence that behavior. Behavioral economics, of course, is understanding how human behavior and psychology influences our economic decisions. For instance, why do people act irrationally or in the opposite way, economic theory would predict? So today's guest is Dan Ariely. You cannot talk about behavioral economics without coming across his iconic research and work. I highly recommend you look at some of his research. It's super fun to read, and that's not something you would really say about research often. Back when behavioral economics became mainstream, Dan was one of the first behavioral researchers that became super popular, along with Danny Kahneman, Cass Sunstein, Malcolm Gladwell, among others. Dan is an Israeli-American and has a fantastic sense of humor that he never fails to bring into his work. He is known for his creative research studies exploiting irrational behavior and doing various economic experiments. He's a New York Times bestselling author with a few different books. The ones I've read are Predictably Irrational, The Honest Truth About Dishonesty, and his newest one, Misbelief. Dan's personal story inspired him to pursue the study of behavior. When he was a teenager, he was involved in a very serious accident that left him with third-degree burns to over 70% of his body. He spent 3 years in the hospital recovering from these burns, and this inspired him to study irrationality and human behavior. Dan has conducted a myriad of research and is currently a professor at Duke University. He has spoken at many events, keynotes, podcasts, you name it, he has probably done it. Dan is a very interesting speaker, and it's a real privilege to share his story and wisdom with all of you. In addition to all of this, Dan has even founded a few companies, such as Irrational Labs. I subscribe to a newsletter from Irrational Labs and really recommend this as well. Now, of course, some of you may have heard that, unfortunately, Dan had been involved in some scandals. In 2021, one of his highly influential papers from 2012 was retracted. And the reason for this was because it was found to have falsified data. The ironic part was that that paper was about dishonesty. Dan took this issue very seriously, and you can find many instances online where he has spoken publicly about the situation. When I spoke to Dan about it, I could feel how important it was to him to get to the bottom of the investigations, and he didn't discount for a second the importance of what was going on. He said that since 2021, Duke had conducted an investigation of their own, and while it is without a doubt confirmed that the study had falsified data, Duke actually found that Dan was not personally involved in the falsification. Dan also mentioned that there have been conceptual replications published of the retracted paper that do demonstrate an effect. I even had a chance to chat with some of Dan's colleagues, such as Guy Hockman and Marielle Beasley. Guy had initiated a letter to the president of Duke to vouch for Dan's character, and Marielle had written a letter of her own as well. When this incident occurred, it had definitely taken the research community by storm. But it's refreshing to see Dan's commitment to being open about the situation and sharing as much information as possible. With that said, in this episode, we see a completely different dimension of Dan. Yes, we get a glimpse of him as the researcher and the scientist, but this episode focuses on the tremendous amount of work he's done in helping the Jewish and Israeli communities post-October 7th. You will hear him talk about applying behavioral science, some of the trends he sees in humanity generally, and Dan also breaks down a lot of weird behaviors we're seeing in people right now. For instance, how do people handle times of high stress and high ambiguity? Why are people so quick to double down on beliefs that are completely false? What can we look forward to in what seems like a dark time? Dan, thank you so much for doing this episode and giving us a completely unique, even VIP view on what you're currently doing. I can proudly say, in this episode, we cover things you cannot easily find Dan talking about elsewhere. I'm really excited about this episode, so without further ado, enjoy. Hello, Dan.
Lovely to be here. What a creative name for a podcast.
Thank you. It's a huge privilege to have you on, not only as a fan of your work, but also as someone who studied behavioral science. Thanks again for doing this.
My pleasure.
So, first of all, how are things going and what are you working on now? What's exciting to you?
Well, how are things going is one question. What am I working on is another one. And what is more exciting is another one. So I think things are going very badly. I know it's not a nice way to start a discussion, but I think that there's lots of situations where there's a fight, there's a struggle. It could be a war, it could be a challenge against global warming, whatever it is, but it's kind of clear what to do. And there are other cases where the world is very, very unclear. And I think that we have now the combination of both of those. So we have the combination of the terrible war in Gaza, plus we have all these other elements that just makes it unclear what this war is really about. For example, the war with Hezbollah in the north adds complexity to it. The involvement of Iran adds complexity to it. The antisemitism in Europe and in the US are adding a lot of confusion. These are people who did not vote to elect Hamas, and they did not vote to elect the Netanyahu government, the Israeli government. How are they connected? Why is my daughter, who's 18-year-old in high school, how come her friends are now Hamas supporters? What do they know, and why would she be canceled if people know she even is thinking about Israel? So that's a very, very confusing thing. Of course, what's happening with the Houthis is also adds to the complexity. So when we think about stress, we think about two types of stress. We think about stress like, oh my goodness, I'm so busy, I don't know how I'll finish the day. And we think about, oh my goodness, I don't understand the world. And I think we have both of those versions. The war between Hamas and Israel is real and complex and painful, and there's lots of real uncertainties. But then there's also this, what is going on in the world? Why are students at MIT asked by the administration not to come through the front door, but to stay in the dorm or to come through a side entrance? So very, very strange. So that was the first part of your question. Since October 7th, it's been very hard to work on anything else that is not connected to October 7th. So I did lots of things, but maybe the main thing I'm trying to move forward is kind of a centralized system for PTSD. And PTSD is a very, very strange disease. I don't know how much you know about this, but it's a very strange disease because in some sense, it's a memory problem. What do I mean that it's a memory problem? It means that, I'll give myself as an example. I can be somewhere with a particular smell or a particular sight or a particular sound, and I can be transitioned back into the burn department, right? That means it's kind of a memory issue. You can't put the past behind. I mean, it's a trauma, but there's also not being able to push the trauma away. And we spend a tremendous amount of energy trying to suppress it. This comes in all kinds of terrible things, like things that look like ADHD, violence, all kinds of things, because people are trying very, very hard to push the trauma away. Now, luckily, there's some really interesting treatments that have been coming up. We all know about the MDMA is showing real success in clinical trials, and hopefully in 2024, the US government, the FDA, will approve it as a treatment. There's some treatment with ketamines, there's some treatment with some psychological techniques, even oxygen pressure seems to be helping. So one of the things that we want to try and do is to say, okay, given that there are going to be lots of people with PTSD, can we centralize that, and can we try to understand who are the people, what treatment might be best for them, and then try to see how effective the treatment is and move forward. But basically creating a centralized, think of it like a centralized database for people who think they might be suffering, doing some initial diagnosis, then trying to send people to the right treatment, seeing what works, what doesn't work, and try over time to also learn what kind of treatment help for what kind of people. I should say that I also spend a lot of time with a couple of the communities that were hurt the most on October 7th. They were, of course, evacuated into multiple places. And I spent quite a few weeks meeting with them as groups, as individuals, and trying to help them figure out what they want to be in the period between. So, at some point, let's hope that the option to return home would show up. What do they do between now and then? It's an undefined point in time, but how do they want to spend the time between now and then? There's a limit to how much fun it is to be in a hotel room. I have to say that these were very, very complex discussions. They came at a very bad time. Like nobody after this trauma can actually make a decision. I would talk to a group or some people about, what do they want from school and community and so on, all these very practical things. And somebody would say, but do you realize that they came into my house on October 7th and they shot somebody? So it was very, very hard to, we all know about this difficulty of making decisions when we are under emotional stress. This is kind of unparalleled emotional stress as far as I've been experiencing in terms of trying to get people to make good decisions. And I didn't succeed so much, I have to say. I didn't succeed so much. And then there's lots of other activities. One of the NGOs that I'm a part of is called Sachi. What we do is we go to communities and we try to recruit the youth that is on the verge of being, on the outskirts or criminal or so on. So we kind of do a bonfire and we start gathering kids around, and the kids who are, maybe not in school and maybe not in such good relationship with their families and so on. And we basically tell them, you know what? We need your help. We say there are people in this community who are not doing well. We teach them how to be spies, commando. We teach them how to be commando units. And we say, we want you to go around the town and we want you to see if you see people that you think don't have enough food or people who have other needs and so on. And they go ahead and they learn how to do it. And once a week, they stand outside of the supermarket and they collect food from people, like people who come out from the grocery shop. They say, hey, if you have an extra bag of rice or something, would you mind donating it? And lots of people do. And then once a week, they get together. They package all the food into boxes. They go to the addresses of the people that they've identified as needing help. They put the box down, they knock on the door, and they run away. And they run away because you're not supposed to give charity when people see it. And the reason is, especially in this case, these are the people from the same community. They don't want to be seen or embarrassed or something like that. So we've had a lot of success. By the way, it's an amazing program. It changes how the youth think about themselves. It changes their attitude toward their family, toward their community, toward their future. All of a sudden, they feel empowered. The giving away food is a nice side benefit, but the real improvement is for the agency of the kids. Anyway, we have lots of kids now who are just roaming around the country. I think Tel Aviv has something like 10,000 kids that are not from Tel Aviv who are not connected. So while there's lots of terrible things, there's also lots of very inspiring interventions from civic society, right? So Sachi, this organization I just told you about, is working extra hard in all kinds of new communities and making a dent. I recently met with a group of wonderful students. These are students at university who basically, about 50 of them, and they just roam the streets at night and look at kids who are, like these kids who have been evacuated. They're some of them are still in a hotel room with their parents. They don't know what to do. So anyway, these kids collect them at night and try to create different activities with them and so on. So what am I doing? So first of all, it's very hard to focus on anything else. So I try to focus on the things that are connected to October 7th and try to figure out what they can do best to help.
I had no idea that you were doing so much work associated with helping, the war efforts and helping restabilize people in the Israeli society and the society that's been impacted. It's a really beautiful evolution for your career, because when I think about you and think about to your earlier career and your accomplishments, I always viewed you as a professor, as a lecturer, as a researcher, as a speaker, as an author. But now you're a strong community builder, and it's one of the most beautiful applications of behavioral science, I think, to go and apply it to an active need and an active pain point.
Yeah, there's lots of versions of what it means to be a researcher and a professor. And I took a turn quite a few years ago in trying to be a more applied social scientist. And not everybody likes it. Maybe most people don't. But I think it is important. And, it does create a real challenge for academics. Academics, many times we want to understand the problem perfectly before we're willing to give advice. But waiting perfectly just means maybe waiting too long. I don't have the patience for that. So when I see something like what we're experiencing now happening, I say, okay, I can't wait too long until we figure this out, and let's see what we can do to help right now. And of course, there's many other things that I'm trying to do, but of course, one of the topics also is to try and fight misinformation, which is, of course, very substantial and very painful to see. In 2020, I started being attacked by COVID deniers and death threats, all kinds of things. And it got me to look very deeply into the question of misbelief. I wrote a book on this topic, but of course, the level of misinformation now is dramatically exceeded. So this book came just a couple of weeks before October 7th, but there's so much about this that is so important about how do people start believing what they do, how do we fight it, and so on. So I'm doing also some efforts in that regard. Of course, it's very much an uphill battle. So maybe I'll say a couple of things on that because I think it's important. So one of the things to understand about the adoption of false narrative is that it happens under the condition of stress. And as we said, it's this stress of saying, I don't understand the world. So in COVID, there were lots of reasons. What is this virus? What's happening? Is it China, the lockdown, and so on? And now we're also in a period of high stress. So first of all, we didn't really finish with COVID. We still have some leftovers. But it's also a very stressful situation. What's happening with Ukraine? What's happening with Iran? What's happening with Hezbollah? And I can tell you that my students are also very concerned about technology. What are we doing with these LLMs, with these large language models and ChatGPT and so on, AI?
Yeah, AI.
Some of them are saying, am I going to have a job? When I went to college, I was kind of sure that at the end of college there will be a job. I never thought about, the stress that you have to say, oh, I'm studying this profession. It might not be there 2 years after I graduate. What am I doing? And all of this stress is creating a need for an explanation. And it was true in COVID, and it's true now. And one of the most important antidotes against stress is resilience. Usually we think about resilience as what happens after a tragedy. So you say, okay, you walk around life. Oops, at some point there's a big tragedy. Like in my case, I was badly burned. And then, long time in hospital. And then the question of, usually people think of resilience is, do you bounce back? Do you bounce back? How long it takes you? And that's resilience. But resilience is not just that. Resilience is also the question of how do we manage our life without a tragedy? And do we feel that we would be supported if something bad would happen, right? Something sometimes called secure attachment. Like, do we feel that we're safe, that somebody will catch us? Like we have a general insurance policy for everything. And the world in general, I think, is suffering from a low level of resilience. We don't spend as much time with friends anymore. We spend more time with the nuclear family. At work, we don't talk about politics. We don't talk about personal things. So that's also kind of frays the social connection. Social media is not helping. And of course, economic inequality is also making it harder to ask for favors, reveal things, and so on. So with a high time of stress and low time of resilience, people are now open to a lot of strange beliefs, right? Oh, I just need to find a villain to blame for this. Right. So that's one thing that happens. And, the stress is very hard to fight, but resilience is easier to fight, right? So I think the question now for communities is, how do we create resilience, right? How do we give each other the sense of being supported and cared for and saying, it will be okay and you can trust me and here's the version of this. But by the way, I have a resilience strategy when it comes to giving money to charity. So first of all, when I give money away, I always give it to the general fund. The overhead, the things that are hardest to raise money for. But sometimes I tell people, if somebody asks me for money for their NGO, I said, look, I don't have a lot of money to give away. I have whatever I have. But I'll tell you what I'll do. I'm giving you 3 months to raise this money that you need, whatever you want. And if you don't get it, I'll give it to you. So and this is what resilience is about. It's about, somebody is backing you up. Somebody is backing up. So now the NGO doesn't have to worry. They know their back is covered, and now they can go ahead and try. And often they try more risky things, and often they're successful. And I tell them, look, this money will go to another NGO. It will go to you, another NGO. So if you do an effort and you're successful, somebody else will be helped. And I think kind of anything we do to each other, we're trying to keep resilience, I think is important. The second thing I want to mention is that I really worry about what's happening with antisemitism. And the reason why I'm worried about it so much is because of cognitive dissonance. So just as a memory about cognitive dissonance, right, there was this famous story by Festinger. There was this woman who said the earth will be destroyed on a particular date. Her followers came to be there, and she said only her followers will be saved. The aliens would come and save them. And Festinger thought that the world would not end and the aliens would not come, but he wondered what will happen to her followers. And in particular, he wanted to understand what would happen to her most serious followers. Those are the people who gave up the most. They sold their homes, they said goodbye, they gave all their money to charity, they spent time with her. What would happen to them the most? They, on one hand, you can predict that they would be the most disappointed, and they would be the first to go away. Say, oh my goodness, this woman lied to me, I lost everything because of her, and so on. Or what Festinger said was that they would experience a cognitive dissonance, which means that they would say, I gave up so much. How can I live with the fact that she might not be a real prophet? Oh, no. She must be a real prophet, and she's the one who saved the earth, right? They could
double down, right?
That's right, exactly. They will double down because they can't stand the dissonance between what they did, give up their money, give everything to charity and so on, and what happened. Nothing. And indeed, that's what they saw. They saw that those people became the most committed. They helped her raise more money, recruit more people, and so on. Now, why am I worried about this? Because cognitive dissonance suggests that after we act in a certain direction, our preferences follow. So in the context of American universities, I'm thinking about an undergrad who doesn't know much about Israel, who doesn't know much about Gaza, has some kind of social pressure, some kind of an idea. They join 2 protests and they burn 1 flag. Okay, what do they become at the other end of those activities? According to cognitive dissonance, they become much more consolidated in their preferences. This undergrad might not have known which river and which sea and who started and why and what happened and anything, but after some actions, their preferences are likely to follow. So I'm actually very worried about all the actions that are happening now, and I'm worried that they are shaping opinions in a way that it's going to be very, very tough to fight back.
Something that I think about a lot, especially now, is it feels like people have forgotten how to think critically when they look at the different issues in front of them. And something that I'm proud of as a Jewish person is, at our core, Jews that study Torah, Jews that study history, Jews that go to Hebrew school, we're taught to challenge and to think. And I have hope that maybe that's something we can carry on to a larger society. Maybe that's something we play a role in. Because it's for our sake, right? It's not for anyone else. It's for us.
Yeah. So this question about wanting simple answers and quick answers is a very, very dangerous thing, especially in an age when somebody can take advantage of our desire for simple answers and give it to us. And in social media, it's easier. And in the news, they have this sentence, if it bleeds, it leads, right? We want something emotional, quick, and so on. And yes, it's true. We are trained in many ways to see multiple perspectives, to try and argue for a little point, even all kinds of funny little points. Terminology for this, which I don't like the terminology, is called kind of intellectual humility, right? And the notion of intellectual humility is basically saying, let me entertain 2 hypotheses. I have the hypothesis that Israel has the right to defend itself, and I have the hypothesis that the Palestinians have the right for their own country, and I have the hypothesis of saying that Hamas doesn't represent the Palestinians, and just kind of lots of hypotheses that you say, so what's the story? And I say, oh, it's very complex. I don't know. And I think that's actually one of the biggest disappointment with students, is that they're supposed to understand how to embrace complexity. Like a good lecture is a lecture when the students come out of and they say, oh my goodness, the world is more complex than I thought. And there's more to study and there's lots that I don't understand and so on. But as we said, under conditions of stress, people try to find answers very, very quickly. But we certainly need to work, like with all the things we need to fight. I think this notion of intellectual humility is one of them, is to say, how do we get people to not embrace so quickly simple narratives for the world.
Do you think there's something that can be done? I mean, when I was studying behavioral science at Penn, the most effective mechanism I saw for breaking down some of those assumptions and hardcore beliefs was around debiasing. And if I recall correctly, this has been a while now, what I learned is that debiasing is really effective for a short period of time, but over time it needs to be supplemented or repeated in order for somebody to continue to lack that bias for an extended period of time. Is there anything that maybe you allude to in your book that people can use to try to fight some of these cognitive biases and this deep-rooted beliefs?
Yeah. So as you remember, one of the challenges is we have dramatic confidence in our opinion without much knowledge. And this is sometimes called the Dunning-Kruger effect, but there's another version of it called the illusion of explanatory depth. And the illusion of explanatory depth is to basically say that we think we understand how things work. But when we're asked about it, we realize we don't really understand it. And then we basically reduce our confidence in our knowledge. And reducing our confidence in our knowledge is the first important step into being open to other hypotheses. If we look at the questions of, let's take something difficult in the US context, abortions. Everybody has an opinion. Everybody has a very strong opinion. Everybody thinks that people who don't believe like them are somehow broken in some moral or functional way and that don't understand things correctly. How do we reduce the confidence that our thing is correct? Now, in the question of abortion, it's a moral question. There's no moving parts, but we have done it. I'll give you two examples. One is with the flush toilet. You say to people, "Hey, do you understand how a flush toilet works?" People say, "Yes, of course." On a scale from 0 to 10,
I do not understand how
you don't
a flush
understand.
toilet works.
Okay.
I'm a 0 on the
Okay.
scale of 1 to 10.
So you would be an easy, not a good candidate for the experiment. But people say, "Yes, I understand." And then you say, "Okay, luckily for you, I have all the pieces of a flush toilet here. Please assemble it." Nobody's able to assemble it. But after they're unable to assemble it, you say, "How much do you understand it?" They say, "I don't understand it at all." Now, in the context of the US, we did this thing with the elections. So we asked people, "Do you understand?" We took people who thought the elections were stolen from Trump. And we said, "Do you understand how elections work? And do you understand how the stealing works?" And people said, "Yes." And then we said, "Okay, so explain it to us. Give us the details." And then people say, "Well, I don't really understand." And then you say, "Okay, so how sure are you that the moment you're not so sure about how elections get tallied and how it was stolen and so on, how sure are you that they were stolen?" And people reduced their confidence. Now, arguing, by the way, is one of those things that is so bizarre. So here's a question. I ask people, I say, "Okay, in the last 3 years, how many of you have had an experience of arguing with somebody for a whole hour? You giving them your point, they're giving you their point, everything. For a whole hour you discuss, and at the end of the hour, they come and they say to you, 'You know what, you're absolutely correct. I have never been so wrong in my life. I'm now changing my opinion. You're absolutely right.' And most people say, 'Never happened to me.' And then you say, 'And how many times have you been convinced by anybody else?' You say, 'Okay, also not very often.' Now, it's a very, very bizarre thing that we almost never manage to convince people. We were never convinced by anybody. But nevertheless, we think that the right approach to convince somebody is to keep on the same strategy. By the way, the reason that we don't convince anybody and we don't get convinced is we don't listen. Because let's say you and I are debating something. So when I would talk, I would focus on how wonderful my points are and how important they are and how correct I am. And when you would talk, I would focus on trying to counter-argue with you in my mind. I'm already building the argument for my next rebuttal to you. So I don't spend any time listening. I spend either talking about my point or defending my point. So at the end of the conversation or discussion, people don't get convinced. But this is why the illusion of explanatory depth is so important, because what we do is we don't argue with people. So let me tell you how it would look like in the Palestinian context, in the Gaza context. So I'm very privileged. I have lots of people I know from all over the world. So people write me or want to talk about what's happening. And we all agree that how terrible it is and so on. And then I say, "Look, I don't want to argue about who is more morally wrong. And I also don't want to talk about historical facts, what happened in 67 and what happened in 48, and whether the Old Testament, the Bible, is older than the Quran or not, and what's the evidence of who was there first. But let's talk about how we move forward. That's something we might have something to say about. And always people say, I want an immediate ceasefire. And I say, of course, I'm not in a position to grant you it, but let's say I would grant you. And they say, now what? And they say, okay, I also want Israel to leave Gaza. I said, okay, let's say I grant you that. And then I say, now what? And they say, what do you mean? This is now kind of like the pieces of a flush toilet. I said, you had a proposition of a ceasefire and the Israeli army, IDF, leaves Gaza, but that's not the end. You can't just end it at that. Now it's just the beginning. I said, what do you mean? I said, okay, Hamas was elected to be the representatives of the Palestinians a long time ago, but they were. Do you let them go back and be in power? And almost everybody that I've talked to said yes. They were the most recent, long time ago, but they were elected. They represent the Palestinians. And I say, do you let them arm again? And they say yes. And I say, atomic weapon? We know they're connected to Iran. Are you letting them arm with atomic weapon? And they say no. I say, what about the Navy? And most people say no. What about the Air Force? Most people say no. And then I say, okay, and what happened when they do the same thing they did on October 7th again? Let's say April 17th. What would you recommend to happen then? And then almost everybody at that point either say, I don't know. Or they come and they say, then the Jewish people need to leave Israel and go somewhere else. Now, if people say the Jewish people need to leave Israel and go somewhere else, then we know they don't think we have the right to exist. And that's a very different discussion, right?
The whole conversation was useless because they should have just been outright.
That's right. These are people that did not admit, maybe to themselves or maybe to me, that they did not think that Israel has the right to exist, and they were pushed to a position to admit it to themselves or to me. But most people that I talk to at this point say, I don't know what to do. It's very, very complex. And, and that I think is the position all of us should have. There are extreme crazy people on all sides, and the extreme crazy people know what to do. And usually their answer is not the right answer. But for most of us, we should say, my goodness, this is a really tough problem. And the more we read and the more we understand, the tougher it is. And let's get together and try to figure out how to overcome it. But let's realize the complexity, and that there's not a simple solution. And I think that's anything in the world, by the way, whether it's climate change or questions with energy or food pollution or plastic. People think, it's like everything is simple. No, everything is very complex. Everything is very difficult, and we should embrace the complexity, listen to all options. I mean, we need to make some steps forward, but we need to understand the complexity. So I think that the illusion of explanatory depth is a very, very important strategy to get people to recognize the complexity and then be open for a real discussion.
So one thing this reminds me of is, for better or for worse, I'm very happy that I studied behavioral science, even though I myself do not work in behavioral science. It's a very well-known fact that behavioral science jobs are kind of rare. Most of them are in academia. They're not the best paying jobs in the market, which may deter a lot of students and professionals from pursuing the degree. But what I am thankful for is it teaches you to assume that you don't know anything about the problem until you've laid out a hypothesis and until you've observed something. And for that, I'm grateful. And I wish that more of our society took on this approach as they thought about these issues, but they haven't had this curriculum in any of their education. And that was the part that I loved about the research that you did, is because you made it super accessible to understand these dynamics and how we behave. And sometimes you took very, outlandish problems, the problems that everyone thought were taboo and nobody wanted to ask people uncomfortable questions. And you went there and you asked those uncomfortable things, and you studied, the most bizarre behavior, and you incentivized the most bizarre behavior. So that's why I love some of your work, which kind of brings me to another topic that I wanted to ask you about. I guess on a lighter note, you recently helped support the creation of a TV show that's based on your books and on your life. It's called The Irrational. I believe it came out towards the end of 2023, maybe in September. What is that experience like when you watch that show? Do you think they figured you out right? Do you think it reminds you of you?
So first of all, I want to one small deviation. When you said social science is a good way to recognize what we don't know, that's usually my strategy when I talk to any company or any startup. So let's say it's a company that does financial decision making. I usually start by saying, what if people don't know how to use money to maximize their well-being? Or sleep. What if people don't know how to sleep? Or dating. What if people don't know what's a good date for them? And if you think about it, we are kind of crazy amateurs. Really, there's nothing that we're good at. We don't know how to eat well. We don't know what's good for us in so many ways. And asking the question, what if people are amateurs at? What if people don't know what? And let's start from that. Let's just realize that, it changes completely. It's a very good way to start a discussion. In terms of this TV show, The Irrational, so it was an unbelievable adventure. So first of all, when they were writing the pilot, they wanted to see pictures of my apartment, and they wanted to do pictures of my office. I'll tell you a funny story. So at some point, they asked me, what do I drive? And I have a Volkswagen Golf. So Alec in the show gets a Golf. And then, the script goes back and forth. And I feel like, this guy is my alter ego. He got divorced recently. I got divorced a little earlier. He needs a convertible. He needs like a midlife crisis car. So I change in the script and I give him a convertible. And the script goes back and forth. And the more he's with his convertible, the more I figure I need one too. So I go online and I put a little bit of money down and I order this convertible, but it's COVID. And they say it's a 2-year wait time. Okay, so luckily, about 6 weeks later, I give a talk to the company that makes these little convertibles. So I print a T-shirt with my order number, F23, and I give the whole talk with this T-shirt. And when it's time for the Q&A, I say to the people, okay, you're probably time for Q&A, but you're probably wondering, what is this number for? I said, I ordered a car from you. You said 2 years. I want it next month. A few weeks later, I had a little convertible. But then on the pilot, they crashed it. They changed the pilot, they crashed it, but I still have my convertible, and it's thankful for the show. But in terms of, I think they're depicting social science very nicely. I give them comments on everything that has to do with the experiments. And so I give comments about the experiments, about the relationship between the professor and his students and research assistants and so on. And I also give comments about my personality, because there are some things like I developed the belief in deep dating, that you go on the first date and you make it 3 days. And it might fail, but if it works, it's amazing. So Alec had this 24-hour date. They wouldn't do it for 72 hours, but they agreed to do it for this. So there's a lot of my personality.
So you gotta go on Love is Blind, is what you gotta do. That's a show for you. That's deep dating.
I think deep dating has to be very personal and very courageous. I think people need to reveal a lot about themselves and trust the other person and so on. I'm not sure that being in front of the television is the right structure, but and I don't know also how much these people are really opening up for this. So anyway, there's lots of things about this. I went to LA to see the first episode being aired, and at the end of the first episode, Alec has this guy that had PTSD and is also had kind of false memory issues, and he asks him for advice. And Alec gives him advice, and that was my advice. Like, I wrote that piece, and I asked the actor, I said, that was very meaningful to me, because I wrote this advice to your character, and how was it for you? And he said he loved the advice. He said he felt it was one of the best advice he got in all of his years of therapy. So yeah, I feel it's television, it's quick, lots of things happen, there are shortcuts, but I think some of the essence of social science is captured, both in terms of the research, how to use the research, but also kind of the humanity of living, how to live better.
So as you're looking forward to a world after October 7th, and after, we get through this time of crazy ambiguity, crazy stress, as you said, what is something that you're optimistic about?
So look, this tragic period in our lives, and end of COVID, and this war in Ukraine, Russia, East versus West, Israel, Hamas, within the US. There'll be a lot of elections this year. This will be certainly a year of turmoil. My hope is that we will recognize the junctions that we're facing. Most of life we don't recognize the junction. I'm doing lots of work now on end of life. I'm thinking about the chapter when people get a final terminal illness diagnosis until the end of life. It's a chapter of slightly longer than 5 years on average. And when I talk to palliative care experts, they think it could be the best chapter in people's lives, for most people. Now, it's not that the last 3 weeks of life could be the best 3 weeks, but this last chapter, the 5 years, can be the most amazing one. And why? Because when people get a terminal illness diagnosis, it forces them to examine life. What have I missed? Like, why haven't I talked to my kids? Why haven't I talked to my brother? Why am I doing this? Why am I not doing this? I always said it will be later. It's a very sad statement about human nature, that we need kind of a terminal illness diagnosis to look at things and grasp, and usually we live an unexamined life. But a terminal illness diagnosis gets people to have an examined life, and then they improve all kinds of things. It's kind of a crazy idea, right? That by simply forcing people to examine their life, they can do such improvements. Now, maybe at age 30, it's too early, but still, it's an amazing idea. I think that this period is going to be very complex across the world. And I think the question is, will we use it to re-examine our lives? The odds are not in favor because it's really tough to examine. And we have lots of countries involved, and it's very hard to coordinate effort. But I think that this fork in the road, that sometimes toward the end of 2024, we recognize where we've been headed in terms of not acting together, and hate and violence, respect to people, respect to the planet, you name it. I think there is a chance that we would recognize that we are facing a junction, and we need to act on it. And I'll just take as an example something relatively small like social media. I think, don't catch me on the numbers, but I think that when there was the class action lawsuits against cigarette companies, it was $230 billion, something like that. If there was a class action lawsuit now against social media, what do you think would be the number? Now, some things are harder to compute. It's hard to compute the effect on depression. It's hard to compute the effects on social isolation. It's hard to compute the effect on lack of trust in medicine, lack of trust in government, hate toward minorities, hate toward other people. But imagine we would start quantifying it. What do you think would be the effect? Like, what would be the class action lawsuit for? My guess is the effect will be much bigger than cigarettes. But as long as the problem is not big enough, we're not going to recognize it. So I think we're coming to this complexity from COVID and the wars and identity politics and separation and inability to act, that just requires some big steps. And the question is, will we recognize that we got to this junction, and will we make the big, brave steps? We know that default is easier, right? It's easier not to do anything. But I hope we will make some serious steps.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That's very powerful and definitely something to be optimistic toward. I agree. You're not the first guest to talk about the tremendous power social media has had on us and the consequences of these platforms. And another podcast guest brought up repealing Section 230, which gives that protective layer to social media to not have any consequences for the material that's being distributed and how it affects the average person. I also agree with you that it would be the economic impact of a lawsuit like that would be much larger than anything cigarettes ever saw. As we wrap up here, I have just 2 quick questions for you. The first is, how can people stay connected with you? How can they follow your work on social media? This evil thing that we just talked about, or otherwise?
So I have a website, danariely.com, DANARIELY.com. I do kind of a newsletter, so I share some things from time to time. I'm now working on a new website on bureaucracy. As you can imagine, it's not one of my. It's a topic. I don't like bureaucracy. I think what happened is that bureaucracy has a lot of hidden costs that people don't see, And I think it creates lots of damage. I'm going to come up with a lot of material on trying to vent against bureaucracy.
My favorite part of your website is you have a contact page. And on that contact page, you mentioned that you do receive a lot of outreach from different people and organizations. And you've created pre-populated videos with certain responses. Like, if you're looking to get a yes from me, play this video. And in that video, it'll be like, yes, I think your idea is fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing it with me. Or if you want me to disagree with an idea, you have, here's a video where I disagree with your idea. I think that was fantastic and hilarious. So it's a great website. Kudos to you. So my last question for you, it's one that I ask every guest, is who would you like to nominate for People Do You Want to Know podcast?
So I would nominate the chief rabbi of South Africa, Rabbi Warren Goldstein. And many years ago, I got to meet him, and I used to have a standard question for chief rabbis. And I would ask them, from the 10 commandments, if I had to pick one, which one would you recommend? And Rabbi Zaks, may he rest in peace, and Rabbi Goldstein gave me the same answer. And the answer was Shabbat. Keep the Sabbath. And both of them said it for the same reason. They both said that most of the commandments make sense. Thou shalt not murder. I mean, we don't need a lot of reasons for it. But taking a day off seems counterproductive. We're trying to make progress. Why take a day off? But they said that in Judaism, the idea is that a day off gets you to reflect on life and gets you to be more efficient in other ways. So it's a day off, but it's not less. It's just helping. And the next day, Rabbi Goldstein woke me up. He wakes up very early, way too early than me. And he says, let's get all the Jewish people in South Africa to celebrate Shabbat. And we started a project called the Shabbat Project over 10 years ago. And we try to get all the Jewish people in the world to celebrate one Shabbat together. And it's been amazing. It's been amazing. You know, people try what it means to be a day without technology and focusing and so on. And he's a very, very thoughtful guy. Obviously, South Africa has been a very complex player in the event since October 7th. And he has a lot of insights about what is happening and why South Africa has been so involved. Sadly, it seems to be linked with Iran and funding and so on. But I think that his view is also that what South Africa has done is going to put such light on the corruption in South Africa that it might actually get things to be better long term. Kind of, again, a question of this. Things are really bad, and we can see if where they're going to emerge. So anyway, I think he's a fascinating guest because of Judaism, because of his role, and also because of what's happening now in South Africa and in Judaism.
Thanks so much for that nomination. It's been really wonderful to have you on. Thank you for doing this.
Thank you. It was very, very lovely. Thanks for thinking of me.
If you've enjoyed this podcast, please go ahead and rate us 5 stars. Be the first to hear our episodes by subscribing to People Do You Want to Know wherever you get your podcasts. And for exclusive content, follow us on Instagram at People Do You Want to Know.